Today we're going to make pie dough. And pie dough is very simple in terms of ingredients. It's really just flour, fat, water, sometimes sugar, and salt. This actually has some brown sugar and salt dissolved into it, which I'll discuss in just a second. The flour itself, flours have different protein content. This is pastry flour, which has a low protein content. When flour comes in contact with moisture or friction, like kneading, it will produce something called gluten, and gluten will give strength and structure to a dough, but if you have too much gluten, it can also make a dough tough. So pastry flour, because it has a low protein content, is a great choice for a pie dough. The first thing you're going to want to do is sift your flour just to make sure that you don't have any lumps. An easy way to sift flour too, without getting any flour onto your table, is to use a whisk, just like this. Especially pastry flour has some lumps in it usually, so you'll definitely need to sift the flour. Pie dough is best made with very cold ingredients. So I've actually been chilling my pastry flour, my water, and my fat in the fridge until they're nice and firm. The reason that the dough ingredients have to be cold is that colder ingredients inhibit gluten formation, and also it makes it a little bit easier to mix in the fat without melting it. I'm making a full recipe that's in your manual. You can feel free to half this recipe. The recipe I'm making now will be enough to make 2 pies with a top and bottom crust. Have a little bit left here that you can push through. The next step now is to mix in the fat. This is shortening. This is vegetable shortening, and the fat is actually quite firm. The reason I'm using vegetable shortening, I'm going to talk actually a little bit about specific fats. So vegetable shortening is good because it has a high melting point, which means that you can mix it longer without it melting. Butter is also wonderful. It has an amazing taste, but it also melts a little bit more easily in your hands. Lard is an option, but it also is animal-based, so you have to make sure that if you are using it, you cannot give the pie dough to a vegetarian or a vegan or someone who can't eat meat product for any other reason. What you're going to do is put your fat into the flour and just toss it first of all to coat it. So the flakiness in a pie dough is actually caused by small little particles of fat. We want them to be about the size of peas that in the oven melt, produce steam, and that steam gives the dough little pockets of air, which produces the flakiness. So what you have to do is you actually have to take your hands and sort of use a motion like this to break the pieces of shortening into those pea-sized particles. Now, you have to be very careful when you do this because if you overwork the dough, you're going to get a dough that doesn't have those pea-sized particles of fat. You're going to have a dough that has very, very small particles of fat, and then you won't get a very flaky dough. You'll get a dough that's called a mealy dough, which is much less flaky. If you underwork the dough, you're going to get a very tough dough. So you have to be very, very careful. So I'm just, as you can see, I'm just gently mixing in the fat. And every now and then I want to check, okay, are my particles pea-sized? So what I do is I shake the bowl. The bigger particles come to the top, and you can see these are still quite large. So I'm going to break up the larger particles with my hands. And then go through the dough again. There's other ways you can mix dough besides by hand, especially if you have hot hands, you risk melting the fat. You can use a mixer as long as the mixing bowl is fairly cold and you use a paddle attachment and keep a really good eye on it so you don't overmix the fat. You can also use a pastry cutter which is a little tool that has small little blades that you can cut through the fat, or you can even use a fork. Traditionally, a lot of people would just use a fork, or even two knives and cut right through the fat. So now let's check again. We'll give the bowl a shake, clean up the table. And now you can see we have a lot smaller particles. That's probably my biggest one. I'm just going to go through and just mix a little bit more. Again, don't overmix. This is where the cool ingredients come into play. That looks probably like it should be done. Let's give it a shake. And just a few just a few larger on the top. So if I hold it there, you can see I have my pea-size pieces of fat in the dough. If you have a few larger little chunks, you can break them up. Now it's time to add the liquid. Add the liquid all at once. A lot of recipes say to add the liquid little by little, but I find that if you add it little by little, what happens is you end up getting a tough dough because you're mixing, mixing, mixing. As soon as you add liquid to the flour and start to mix, you're producing gluten. So the more you mix, the more gluten you produce, and then the tougher your dough. So you have to be very, very careful. So make a well in the center, and let's go and get our cold water that's mixed with brown sugar and salt. The reason I dissolve the brown sugar and the salt in the water ahead of time is just so that it's easily and more evenly dispersed through the dough. So just to show you that, here's my water and my salt and my sugar. All I do is mix them all together like this with a fork. It then will dissolve, and then make sure it's chilled. In goes my cold ingredients, my cold wet ingredients. A lot of times you'll find that the sugar or the salt will settle in the bottom of the container. Just use a spatula to get it out. And then what I do is I actually gently coax the dry ingredients into the liquid with a fork. I'm doing very, very minimal mixing here just to hydrate all the flour. Now you'll notice that when you finish your pie dough, it will look dry. Avoid the urge to mix it more because actually it takes flour about 20 minutes to fully hydrate. So it's better if you keep it dry, set it into the fridge, and it will hydrate within 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just in the bowl, push it together so it comes together in sort of a shaggy mass. Again, I'm not kneading it, I'm just pushing it together. Then I'm going to turn it out onto the table and finish up there. So just bring the ingredients together and push. This should be what you expect to see. Once the dough is roughly together like this, I'm going to cut it in half. Now, as I mentioned, this dough is meant to be for 2 pie crusts, top and bottom crust. So if you want to half the recipe, then of course it will only have to be cut it will have to be cut a different way. So take the dough and cut it in half. This is one pie, this is the other. Then, if you want, you can even cut each piece in half again. One is for the top crust, one is for the bottom crust. I'm going to show you how to wrap one of them. So this has to rest for, I would say, at least an hour in the refrigerator to relax the gluten, to hydrate the flour, and to make it nice and cold so that it's easily rolled. So what you want to do is get some saran wrap and wrap it up. Put your dough in the saran wrap and make it flat and more or less round. The reason we do this is so that it cools down more quickly, and it's also easier to roll out when it comes out of the fridge. You should be able to see your little spots of fat in the dough. That's how you know you've mixed it properly. Do this for all of your pieces of dough, put it on a sheet tray, and chill in the refrigerator for at least an hour.